you trying to do? Before we start, we want to acknowledge that we're in the homeland of many American Indian communities, both ancestral and contemporary. We'll honor our American Indian hosts by taking a moment to listen to an unsettling expression of Thanksgiving. So if you can take your card out and turn to the text that we're going to be reading. It's card number 7.
Go migwech wiananik awe siak mitigwakin bean towat.
Can I play it again?
Yeah, go ahead and play it again. Meg told me she'd give me an easy one, but I don't think that's what I got.
Go migwech wiananik awe siak mitigwakin bean towat.
So you can see the translation. We thank them, the animals, for the forests. They clean them. And when we think about what our original pedagogies were, a lot of our youth back in the day would have been told to go out and to watch the animals and to learn from them as they go through the woods. And we have a lot of stories in our old traditions about learning about medicines from what bear would eat or what deer would eat. And so to me, that's what this in some ways evokes. But we're here today to introduce Jennifer Nez Denetdale. And as always, we have some wonderful gifts, right? We have our AIS t-shirt with the reading in all of our languages here, as well as this beautiful woodland pattern blanket. So those are here for you. You're very welcome. And we're so pleased that Jennifer was able to come and speak for us. She's the first Diné to earn a PhD in history and specializes then in the history and culture of her community. She's written a book, Reclaiming Diné History, The Legacies of Navajo Chief Manuelito and Juanita. And this is a very special book for her because these are her relatives and was able to put a lot of oral tradition into this and really correct a kind of colonized narrative that had been out there concerning Manuelito. Her current research is a history of Diné women that also incorporates oral tradition, expressing her belief that, quote, story and history cannot be separated because storytelling is a valid form of historical production. I couldn't agree more, and I'm so glad that you'll be here to tell us more about that.
I should use this here. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. They have been she Jennifer Denetdale and she ogun shlon ashin bashish chin kisachini da she to hajini da shinala to haj and the UC that nasha the University of New Mexico area shanan nishnat do sha'altra. That is who I am as a Navajo, as a Diné woman. I'm a citizen of the Navajo Nation. I am of the Weaver clan on my mother's side, and my father's side I am of the Salt clan. My maternal grandparents are Red House, and my paternal grandparents are Twidnich Eatney, which is, I can't even think of what the translation might be, but that's who I am as a Navajo woman. I teach at the University of New Mexico in American Studies. I started in history departments and then moved into American Studies, which I'm very happy to be in an American Studies program. And what I'm sharing with you today, first I want to thank the Center for 21st Century Studies and particularly Ken Ferguson, who reached out and made an effort to invite me, and we've talked a lot about Indigenous studies. So thank you very much for this invitation to share my work with all of you. I want to start with a couple of stories about experiences that shaped my thinking on Navajo narratives of kinship and belonging, and how these ways of belonging persist against formations of modern tribal nation building that might be better understood as legacies of settler colonialism. So Saturday night, I am at Sidewinder's Bar, which is a gay bar in Albuquerque, where the Colors of the Wind Indigenous Drag Show is about to begin. Relatives and friends I have met since I first came out as an ally of Diné LGBTQ relatives are part of the gathering and the performers of the night's events. Some of my students have also joined us, and Red Nation, a local Native organization for justice for Indigenous peoples, has set a table up to give out information on the organization. I spent an evening delighting in and swaying to the music as one after another the performers appear dressed in dramatic costumes and ultra-feminine makeup. One performer known as Lady Shug, you have a picture of Lady Shug here, Miss New Mexico Pride, comes out in a magnificent gown, waves her beautifully manicured hand, and lip syncs as she effortlessly dances on stilettos. My favorite drag performer, Stella Martin, who is a Navajo trans woman, once again steals the show with her dance to a song that highlights injustice against Indigenous peoples. Her sequined body tank top has cone nipples, and her headdress is reminiscent of a ceremonial headdress. It's magnificent. This drag show is only one of two that I have attended, with the first one being one performed in my honor. The drag queens honored me as one of the biggest queens, and I was elated. Several months earlier, my siblings and I organized for the first time on our own a blessing wave ceremony for our elderly parents. We had always depended upon our parents to organize our ceremonies, our blessing ways, and my parents did most of the planning, including the arrangements for the medicine person. This time, we did the ceremonies ourselves. And the second time we did a ceremony, me and my siblings were now in our 50s and early 60s. The second time was the women's puberty rites ceremony, the Kinalda for our granddaughter. Both ceremonies went beautifully, and we were reminded once again that we are the grandchildren of the holy people. Through beautiful songs and prayers, we reaffirmed our connection to each other, to the Mother Earth, to the sacred mountains that are our leaders, to the holy people, to Stanadlehe, changing woman, who is the mother of all Diné. I felt a contentment and energy, a sense of thankfulness and joy that these spaces inspire. As I think about these spaces of Indigenous drag and Navajo ceremony, I reflect on how they are both spaces where I allow myself to be who I am as a Diné woman who has an investment in seeking justice for my people. I marvel that these two seemingly different spaces create the same feelings of freedom, love, and compassion. I share with my Indigenous feminist colleagues, and one of them coins, quote, "Indigenous drag is ceremony," unquote. What is it about these spaces that recreate and affirm a sense of belonging that belies the kinds of nationalist belonging to a nation that institutionalizes heteropatriarchy to exact belonging and unbelonging by race and gender? And what do these spaces say about what Audra Simpson asserts, that against the ravages of settler colonialism that still haunt our nation's communities and families? She says, we simply refuse to stop being who we are. We refuse to stop being Indigenous, to stop being Haudenosaunee, to stop being Diné. And it is this refusal to stop being who we are that I want to address today. My presentation is part of the scholarship that I have been working on for a while and have written chapters and essays on this topic, on the establishment of a modern tribal a modern Navajo nation's intersection with gender, and how leadership, laws, and policies have addressed questions of citizenship and belonging, of how we belong in networks of family, clanships, and relationships that reflect the Diné principles of K'eh, our word of how we relate to each other and determines how we should treat each other. A relative on Facebook shares his contributions as part of the Navajo community who recently responded to the abduction of one of our children this week, who was kidnapped and killed this week. And there was a massive outpouring from the community, particularly the Navajo community. And this relative says about the bonding that came about as people mourned together. He said, quote, "K'eh is that inexplicable sense of kinship that ties us all together. It is our shared humanity. It is K'eh that draws me from the opposite side of the Navajo Nation to this place. And it is K'eh that lets me find a home and a family here," unquote. So historically then, I'm a historian, so I do a lot of my work in documents. Historically, federal Indian policies meant the transformation of indigenous nations and people into mirror images of Western democracies. This democracy requires indigenous people to transform who we are, our beings as loving, generous, and compassionate, who relate to each other on the age-old principles of K'eh, instead to become reliant on outside foreign-made institutions to address our grievances as the sources for reconciliation and answers. And yet, as many scholars have observed, institutions are often the sources of our grievances, and why would we expect the same institution that creates and perpetuates our grievances to resolve them? Indigenous feminisms and queer critiques brings gendered analysis to theories of settler colonialism and decolonization, to offer spaces to reflect upon the state of tribal nations like the Navajo Nation, and questions we face, including questions of women's leadership, what families, marriage, and sexuality should look like, and how citizens belong and don't belong to our respective indigenous nations. For many of our nations, as a result of history, are founded upon imposed heterosexual patriarchal values that reproduce inequalities and disparities across gender. A little bit of Navajo history, just for background. Our history, Navajo Diné history, is similar to many other indigenous peoples of this land. We face U.S. settler invasions and their war against our people, subjugation and relocation to a foreign place. Since the Diné returned from the concentration camp at Fort Sumner, and this is a picture of Navajo prisoners of war at Fort Sumner, which is the place my people were sent to after my people were militarily subjugated by the American military. So this is the first time between 1863 and 1868 that you actually begin to get photographs of Navajo people. So we have been subjected to ethnic cleansing policies that we still call American assimilation policies. This language of American exceptionalism suggests that the Navajo Nation and its citizens are progressing and moved into the 20th century, particularly with the imposition of the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934, where many tribal nations adopted constitutions and rules of governance based upon Western democratic principles. In 1968, and this is a photograph that was used in a centennial edition to mark the 100-year period from 1868 to 1968 as a period, 100 years since Navajo people returned from the Long Walk and from the concentration camp at the Bosque Redondo. In 1968, considered a centennial year of the Navajo tribe because it had been 100 years since our people returned from Huelde, a year-long celebration included events, activities, and publications that encouraged Diné to reflect on the 100 years between 1868 and 1968. How far had we come to be a nation? What characteristics determined what a nation looked like? Have we progressed since the people's return? And how do we measure what progress means? Okay, so the imposition of democratic values has also meant the imposition of these narratives of progress and development, which shaped the modern Navajo Nation as well. And I'll speak a little bit to that and give you examples from some work that I've been doing. Western knowledge systems that are ontologically and epistemologically grounded in differentiation are being interrogated to illuminate how cultural differences become sites for seeing culture and tradition as stagnant and remnants of the past. We are peoples who have been profoundly shaped by our experiences under settler colonialism. It is an entangled past, present, and future that we endeavor to understand, for we are still dealing with the consequences of land theft, violence, and all manners of social ills that accompany profound losses. Chippewa historian Jean O'Brien, in her History of New England, demonstrates how histories and other American narratives validate indigenous dispossessions. Diné scholar Glen Coultard and Haudenosaunee scholar Audra Simpson illuminate how the imposition of democratic values in Canada, called the recognition process, actually maintain U.S. and Canadian authority over nations and peoples and through violence. Thus, the title of my presentation, quote, "Refusing the Gift of Democracy," unquote, is inspired by Coultard and Simpson, who argue that principles of Western democracy actually straitjackets our nations and peoples into acquiescence to ongoing exploitation of our lands and resources and an acceptance of a society based upon heterosexual patriarchal values. Indigenous feminisms and queer critiques, including the work of Joanne Barker, Mishana Goman, Nick Estes, and Melanie Yazzie, have shed light on the ways that modern tribal nations replicate heteropatriarchy, where we struggle with gender discrimination and disparities, homophobia and violence against women, and our relatives who are of multiple genders. As feminist scholar Anne McClintock writes, quote, "All nations depend on powerful constructions of gender. Despite nationalism's ideological investment in the idea of popular unity, nations have historically amounted to the sanctioned institutionalization of gender differences," unquote. Audra Simpson in Mohawk Interruptus argues that tradition and culture must be tied to critiques of state power, hegemony, history, while Joanne Barker delineates in case studies how the categories of tradition, culture, and authenticity are deployed in modern nation building to maintain the status quo of gender inequalities and disparities and homophobia. In modern tribal nation building, some of us belong less than others. Indigenous queer critiques have unveiled how nation formations are really about disciplining to create citizens who accept heteropatriarchy rule as natural and normative. As a Diné scholar and woman, I take to heart several generations of Indigenous scholars' arguments that our obligations and responsibilities are to Indigenous nations in the support of tribal sovereignty and self-determination, defend the land and our rights, and yet I am troubled by the deep contradictions of what nation building means and what nations do to their citizens, for as feminist scholar Vina Dawes points out, claims to sovereignty have also meant states declaring that they have the sovereign power to exact violence on their own citizens. Claims to sovereignty are used to intimidate and harass citizens, to silence and obedience, even when citizens object to injustices and inequalities. Daz's point, I think, is also applicable to how the Navajo Nation treats its women and its LGBTQ, for we experience compounded violence in multiple forms. In fact, I have not been able to gather data regarding the amount of violence that these two groups, women and LGBTQ, experience on the Navajo Nation. And what we do have is a very large number of stories of experience, observations, and personal testimony that speak to this incredible violence that we exist in on the Navajo Nation. And in the case of tribal nations, the language of tradition and culture is often used to overlook, ignore, and legitimate the status quo. A theoretical framework that simultaneously examines the historical establishment of Native nations and how they are dependent upon powerful constructions of gender illuminate how Native nations, like other modern nations, are contested systems of representation that severely limit women's and LGBTQ's access to power in myriad ways. My initial introduction to the questions around modern Navajo Nation building and gender came into being when in 2005 the Navajo Nation Council passed the Diné Marriage Act, which is the same-sex marriage ban. After passionate public debate, the person who introduced this, Larry Anderson, his legislation came at a time when the rest of the United States was also contemplating such legislation to add an amendment to the U.S. Constitution that would make marriage between a man and a woman as the only legitimate marriage. Said Anderson, his legislation was intended to, quote, promote strong families and strong family values, not discriminate, unquote. His proposal was made palatable to his constituents by saying, quote, traditionally Navajos have always respected the woman and the man union. Family values are important. The Navajo elders said we should respect both men and women, unquote. Ironically, and perhaps not intended, the debates leading up to the passage of the Diné Marriage Act opened up space to make public what is often relegated to the domestic and intimate spheres. Intimate matters of marriage and sexuality made visible, demonstrated that the personal is always matters of the state that must always be creating and recreating a state based upon heterosexual patriarchy. Any other kinds of political, social, and cultural formations threaten the rule of order. Moreover, as the United States announced the sanctioning of same-sex marriage across the states, tribal nations like the Navajo Nation are then positioned as backwards because our leaders are following, quote, tradition, unquote, appear to be sanctioning gender discrimination. Okay? So that's kind of what I'm following in current articles and references to the Diné Marriage Act, that it's often positioned as the Navajo Nation being backwards and tradition being backwards, you know, and that's just not the case, and that's not the way to read what's happening on the Navajo Nation in regards to the efforts to repeal the Diné Marriage Act. So in that sense, then, nothing could be further from the truth, for it is not the modern American and Navajo Nation with their promotion of ideals of democracy, freedom, and progress, and for Navajo people, tradition, that lie at the foundation of a resurgence of the memory of those who claim identity, sexualities, and belonging, that has led to a remembering of our relatives who are LGBTQ, but it is the people, Diné, our family, relatives, and allies, who remind us about the principles of K'eh. In the framework of K'eh, we remember all our relatives, all our citizens of our nation, which include LGBTQ, the Two-Spirit, and the Nudle. Further, and this is something that I've been working on, my interrogation into the myriad ways that the category of tradition is deployed to maintain male power in modern tribal governance leads me to questions about who becomes responsible for cultural erosion and the loss of traditional knowledge. I have heard too often our own people constantly express dismay, worry, and grief that we Diné have lost, are losing our cultural teachings, our ceremonial knowledge, and our language. Ostensibly, once we have expressed a sense of loss, then we point to our young people, women, and LGBTQ as the source of this loss, even though we know full well that the workings of settled colonialism is at the heart of our grievances, the politics of distraction at work. I turn now to the processes of history to better understand how tribal nation building is also about movements to citizenship that is acceptable to Southern nation sensibilities. In creating Navajo citizens of both the U.S. and the Navajo Nation, it is crucial to recreate them in the model of Western democracies that prize heteropatriarchy and have no trouble using violence to discipline us. Regulations, laws, and policies become the new source of the war on indigenous peoples as families, marriages, and sexuality become the targets to remake us. And I want to share two examples with you of how I trace the processes of a shift in traditional practices and attitudes. As I do this work, one of the things that I come up against with my own people, particularly conservative traditional people, is this notion that tradition and culture is static and unchanging, that it's been like this since time immemorial. And so I share my work with them to get them to think a little bit more critically about how traditions and practices actually change, and actually how much of that change is also connected to the imposition of notions from the U.S. about domesticity, for example. So the first one that I want to share with you, and this essay is going to appear, this work is going to appear in an anthology of critical indigenous feminist scholarship, and it's edited by Joanne Barker. So I was at the National Archives several years ago, looking through folders, and I came across this one thick folder, and it was a folder on a historical event that happened on Navajo, and it's called the Uprising. They call it the Uprising at Beautiful Mountain of 1913. Okay, and so the Uprising at Beautiful Mountain of 1913 has received considerable attention by Navajo studies scholars. And at Shiprock, New Mexico, which is a community in northern New Mexico on the Navajo Nation, at Shiprock, New Mexico, Navajo men defied the Indian agent at Shiprock after one man's wives were jailed because he continued to practice polygamy. The jailing of the women because the men were away was the Indian agent's strategy to force compliance with American laws. Most who have written about this incident have written about it as a turning point for Navajos from traditional practices to assimilation to American ways. A racist amount of violence and gendered violence the American state was willing to use to enforce its will upon Navajos. This happens over a course of 3 months. Okay? The Indian agent finds out that these Navajo men are still practicing polygamy, goes over to their community to find them and to jail them. Instead, takes the women into custody, and then the men come and break the women out, and that turns into this really big, huge event. And at the center of it is the Indian agent's determination that the Navajo people will comply with his orders and with the mandate that they will follow American rules about what families look like, okay, marriage between a man and a woman, monogamy. And so the initial reason for the event evolved around polygamy and the Indian agent's determination to abolish the practice. However, the charge does not get answered by judicial authorities. Lost also in the narratives produced about the event are the women who are never heard from. Neither do we learn anything about polygamy as a traditional Navajo practice. The Beautiful Mountain case illustrates how the transition of the Diné into willing citizens of the U.S. and then their own tribal nations occurred through institutions that are regulated and employed technologies of surveillance to monitor their identities and practices, from health and education and health to marriage and sexuality. Okay? So one of the things about some of these cases that I find in the late 20th century and early 20th century is, and gets understated, is just how much coercion, harassment, and intimidation that federal Indian policymakers, officials, how much violence they're willing to use against Navajo people to coerce them into the normative nation formation. Okay? That always gets understated, and I find that actually quite a bit of violence is used to coerce them. Okay? My second example that I want to share with you comes from the book chapter I'm currently working on, and it focused on the photographs of Milton Snow. This is Milton Snow. His photograph collection numbers over 12,000, and it is housed at the Museum of Northern Arizona and the Navajo Nation Museum. Snow was born in Alabama, and then his family moved to Southern California. He was hired by the Navajo Service to document the devastation and the rehabilitation of the Navajo people in the aftermath of the livestock reduction of the late 1930s and 40s. The work that he produced on behalf of the Navajo service was used as documentary photograph, okay, to document and legitimize and validate the treatment of Navajo people, particularly the confiscation of over 50% of their livestock. Okay? And then to show pictures like this one, which is near Mount Taylor, one of our sacred mountains, just how Navajo livestock had devastated the land and the environment. Okay? So photographs were used first to illustrate how Navajos were to blame for the environmental devastation, but also to show how Navajos were being rehabilitated through U.S. settler generosity of sharing Western technologies of better land use, agriculture, and economics. Okay? I intend to draw upon Snow's photographs. Snow's photographs were also used to share with the larger world that Navajos were embracing Western democratic principles, and to Navajos that the Western world could show them what an improved society looked like. Okay? I queer Snow's photographs to demonstrate how Navajos were once again exposed to technologies and surveillance intended to continually reproduce them as citizens who embrace Western patriarchal values. Okay, so these photographs, because Navajos are illiterate in the 1940s and 50s, these photographs are then used as ways to encourage them to embrace Western superiority, you know, in terms of technologies, and agricultural knowledge, even domestic knowledge about how to have a better home space, home site, how to be better mothers. And so in the 1950s, they built day schools, and they encouraged the women to come in and use the facilities. And this was a way to get them used to the ideas of what domesticity should look like. Okay, so here you have a couple. This is a Milton Snow photograph. You have a couple of women here using the sew machines at the day school. Okay. They also use the fairs. I always tell my Navajo audience this. You guys really like to go to the fairs, which are traditional, you know, since 1938 when the Indian agent at Shiprock introduced the fairs. And these were places to demonstrate to Navajos the superiority of Western knowledge. And so you have here showing the audience how a mother should wash and care for her children, okay, for her baby. And they're smiling, and the man is, you know, explaining it to the Navajo audience there. And so here's one, you know, this Navajo people always really like the baby pageant too, the baby contest. The baby contest really came out as a way for the matrons and the nurses, the white matrons and nurses, to get access to the mothers and the children, to extend their knowledge or to let the Navajo women know proper mothering techniques, proper hygiene. You know, so on the back of the caption on the back of this one is that this mother and this baby enjoys being clean. Okay, like we didn't know anything about hygiene or cleanliness or nutrition. Okay? And so those photographs and this ideology of what families should look like is disseminated and conveyed in these photographs. These ideas of modern Navajo Nation also is very much tied and linked to development. Okay, so it's in the late 50s and 1960s that you begin to get all these messages. Now our leaders and people, and those photographs are really important in this, to assure Navajo people that if they allow the development of their natural resources, they too could live in prosperity like any other American citizen. And so you have this this three-dimensional exhibit at the Navajo Fair, and this is a exhibit on the sawmill at Navajo. And so, you know, those are, they're all tied together, this ideology and how natural resources development fits. Okay? I'm always interested in what lies outside of the borders of the photographs. Okay? And one of the things about these photographs, particularly about development, is that our development of our natural resources has benefited the larger Southwest. Okay, so that our water and our coal has created urban spaces like Phoenix, like Los Angeles, like Las Vegas. And today, our people still haul water one way 30 miles. Okay? And so, what exactly does development do for Navajo people? What has it done and what hasn't it done? And how has it also shaped our notions about what family and domesticity and marriage and sexuality look like? Okay, so those are some of the questions that I've been interested in as I work on these photographs. So Queer Snow's photographs to demonstrate how Navajos were once again exposed to technologies and surveillance intended to continually reproduce them as citizens who embrace Western patriarchal values. As anthropologists like W.W. Hill noted, by the 1930s, after exposure to boarding school and American ethnic cleansing policies, Navajo boys came home and publicly taunted a nudle, and a nudle is a third gender. This is a person who is acknowledged and is someone who has both biologically male and female sex organs. Okay, so this is a third gender that's acknowledged in our society. Boys publicly taunted a nudle and the nudle who then went home and returned to dress in appropriate masculine attire, Western Navajo men's attire. Western democratic ideals imposed upon the Diné has met the institutionalization of heteropatriarchal values that sanction hatred against our own relatives. Okay? And so one of the dilemmas that I see as I work through these issues is the constant claim that based upon traditional values, and if you just go back and look at the traditional stories, you will see evidence of gender variation, that in fact we acknowledge 3 sexes and 4 genders. Okay? And yet today, even though we make those claims and that based upon traditional principles and values, we are accepting of our queer relatives. And in fact, I find that that's not the case. And so the contradiction that traditionally we accepted them, and today to see the homophobia, what I tend to see is that the attitudes of conservative Christian Navajos is not very different from the attitudes of conservative traditional Navajo people. Okay, they both exhibit elements of homophobia. Okay, so how do you deal with that question, particularly when we could keep it saying that based upon tradition, our relatives were more accepted and they belonged to us. By the late 1950s, it appeared that Navajo leaders had embraced Western-style democracy and all the trappings of modernity and progress. The mostly Navajo male council delegates legislated norms for marriage and sexual practices to bring them into line with American beliefs and practices. In 2005, we saw the Diné Marriage Act, and then we see the Diné fundamental laws being invoked to sanctify marriage and family practices as nuclear heterosexual family units. Okay, so the work that I've done traces that process of how tradition has changed, and I think that's important, to map it and to show that what we practice today also can be changed as well, so that we demonstrate and practice a kind of citizenship where we all belong to our nation. Interdisciplinary scholarship has helped me think through the Navajo Nation and its intersection with gender, and how the concept of Indianness moves not through absence but through reiteration. How we have come to know intimacy, kinship, and identity within an empire born out of settler colonialism is predicated upon discourses of indigenous displacements that remain within the present everydayness of settler colonialism, even if its constellations have been naturalized by hegemony, and even if its oppressive logics are expanded to contain more and more historical experiences. The 2 experiences that I shared with you at the beginning, I think, are about those spaces that persist outside of the multiple institutions that shape and discipline us into normative heterosexual patriarchy. These spaces that foster a sense of belonging to each other based upon our word of kinship at an individual level, are what Mark Rifkin calls sensation that registers aspects of collective memory and belonging occluded by the federal government's apparently affirmative narration of Native community. This dynamic speaks to the presence of unacknowledged political negotiations, historical trajectories, and social formations as structure of feeling. Raymond Williams develops this concept to address the ways that, quote, practical consciousness is almost always different from official consciousness, unquote, registering, quote, experiences to which the fixed forms do not speak at all, which indeed they do not recognize, unquote. Rifkin further observes all that is present and moving, all that escapes or seems to escape from the fixed and the explicit and known is grasped and defined as the personal. And earlier, and he notes of modes of domination that what they exclude often may be seen as the personal or the private or the natural or even the metaphysical. These kinds of feelings characterized as personal can refer not only to the forms of experience that lies at the edge of conscious awareness, but to those associated with entire social configurations that lie outside or challenges the parameters of existing structures of domination. An indigenous and Diné structure of feeling can refer to a sensation of belonging to place and people, excluded from settler governance and indigenous governance, but that remains present mostly viscerally in the effective lives of indigenous people. And that's one of the things that I've enjoyed most of being a part of these multiple communities is how we belong to each other, and it doesn't, for a lot of people, we negotiate, we critique, we resist these institutions that always intend to surveillance and to discipline us. And yet in these spaces, we find freedom and liberation and being who we are, for those moments. And those moments are really, really very important so that we can continue to do the work set before us. It's a monumental task we have before us. Structure of feeling refers to the persistence of our relationships with each other based upon this way of acknowledging each other, of showing respect and being responsible and accountable to each other is not reducible to or substantively recognizable within settler ideologies and administrative networks or within tribal institutions, from governance to education to the social and cultural, and to the effects of living under heterosexual patriarchy that can be dismissed by narrating them as private. As Rifkin notes, within the normalizing parameters of bourgeois domesticity, sensual pleasure and enduring emotional bonds are contained inside the boundaries of the conjugally defined household, defining intimacy through isolation. What emerges then is a queer critique of removal in which the erotic provides a rhetorical register and experiential template through which to manifest native placemaking as feeling in ways purposely rendered unintelligible within U.S. and indigenous nation-making administrative discourses. Okay, so I'm really playing with and thinking about how these spaces provide us respite, provide inspiration, and how we relate to and be good allies to our Native and Navajo LGBTQ. So that's what I'm exploring right now, and I just have a conclusion here. I don't think I have any other pictures that I want to share with you. Yeah, that's it. Okay. So today, many Diné are in dialogue with each other and other Native peoples about the meanings of decolonization. We are confronting the ways in which we have internalized foreign beliefs and values now taken as normative in our communities and calling for a return to traditional values. We are examining the internalization of colonial beliefs and practices that have taken root within and are manifested through the gender and race discrimination and sexism that our women and our multi-gendered relatives face within the Navajo Nation and beyond. Principally, I have found that Diné principles of kinship, not incorporated into a modern tribal structure, are renewed to establish relationships with each other, to confirm that we are relatives and we belong to each other. It is from this foundation that so many of our relatives, primarily women and LGBTQ, continue to challenge what oppresses us, from the efforts to save the land to calls for government reform, to an acceptance of all our relatives who deserve to be treated the same in our nation. And I'd like to end with the words of Leanne Simpson, who declares, quote, "We simply cannot build strong indigenous nations until we figure out how to cherish all the bodies that belong to and hold our nation," unquote. Thank you. Should I take questions? I'll take questions.
Excuse me. Thanks, Jennifer. That was great. I have a question about what you're doing with the snow photographs and how they relate generally to your argument about the sort of imposition of a kind of Western domesticity and patriarchy on the Navajo, which seems to me exactly right. Mm-hmm. But I wonder how you relate that to a kind of parallel, or maybe you might see it, I guess my question would be whether you see this as a parallel or a prior movement by Westerners to preserve a kind of, well, preserve is probably the wrong word, to fabricate a kind of authentic Navajo identity in terms of things like weaving, silver making, and so forth. So I'm thinking about that book by Erica Basumic on Indian Maid, where she talks about how there had been this, emphasis in the 20th century to not really to preserve, but really to fabricate a certain kind of native identity that would seem to be resistant to, or at least different from, the kind of incorporation of Western values like sewing machines and so forth that you're talking about.
After I get through with 3 other projects, this book that I'm working on the tentative title is The Navajo Nation, Gender and the Politics of Tradition, and then a couple of volumes on Milton Snow. The 4th thing that I want to do is to go to the land claims paper, the Navajo land claims paper. There's this room in the Navajo Nation Library where there's this incredible amount of documents that were gathered by non-Indians, researchers on behalf of the Navajo Nation to prepare their case before the U.S.'s Land Claims Commission. And that, it's just incredible in terms of the archives, the archaeology, the anthropology, the oral histories, the genealogies, brought over the National Archives, copied it, and so this huge room. And it's, I'm interested in this intellectual project to create a Navajo national identity and a Navajo national consciousness that kind of like creates this notion of what culture and tradition should look like, And so the works of the early anthropologists, of course, their work has been very also instrumental in creating this sense of what Navajo means and what a nation means, and taking that apart and looking at it seriously, and what are the cracks there and what's not there in those formations of Navajo nationalism. Okay, and one of them is this exclusion of women, particularly around leadership, and also the exclusion of our LGBTQ relatives. They just don't register in that in nation making. If you open up just about any Native Nation studies or reader, you look at the context, most likely you will not see an article or essay on tribal nation building and gender. So it's like some kind of specialized field, and a lot of the men don't think they have to do this work. It's for a girl like me to do.
So do you see those 2 projects as contradictory, or do you see them actually as part of the same? By those 2 projects, I mean the preservation of a kind of, or creation of a kind of Navajo identity, and then the sort of giving up the Navajo identity and adopting the Western identity.
I don't think it's an adopting kind of project. I think it's to recognize the persistence and the flexibility of who we are as a people, and that we can be expansive and include everyone. I think it's that part of that kind of project that I'm doing. There's another part to this that I'll bring in, and I'm on the Navajo Nation Human Rights Commission, and I've been trying to work and wrestle with this report on violence against Navajo women and gender. And I have no data, we have no stats. Nobody's ever kept them, even though we know by testimony and personal observation experience that violence is just incredible, that we experience on an everyday level. And put that into a human rights framework, And then I come up against the fundamental law, which is coded Navajo values. And when I raised the question of gender discrimination or homophobia, they're like, no, we don't practice that. Just go back and look at the fundamental laws, And I raised my hand again and I said, yeah, but it doesn't address it. They said, well, you're just not looking close enough. So I'm having difficulty just articulating the interrelationship of human rights, UNDRIP, and Navajo fundamental laws, and the ways in which gender discrimination is practiced and continually ignored on the Navajo Nation. So, hard task to do. Anybody else?
Thanks. I really, really enjoyed your paper and appreciate the work you're doing very much. I was interested that you started with those celebratory images of drag queens.
Yes.
And I'm wondering if through your historical work and this sort of looking for spaces that are cracks, if you like, in the settler colonial experience, whether you're able to identify other kinds of celebratory spaces or places where people who've been able to kind of extract themselves from the oppression of that particular set of gendered relations to do other sorts of things. In other words, could a history be written that gave us quite a different view of activities beyond, kinship on the one hand and this particular way of laying down a heteronormative framework. Are there particular places where we can see these other sorts of relations come alive?
Well, I've been doing a lot of community, kind of trying to do some community organizing with some of my grad students who are committed to justice to Indigenous people. And I think that what is below the radar also is the kind of community organizing that goes on in my communities and how women are actually really at the forefront of these resistance movements. And so working with them and the sense of community and belonging that it creates and perpetuates around land, resistance to development of land, resistance at Big Mountain, where Navajo people have refused to relocate, even though that's federal Indian law. Those are the spaces that I look for and that I work within. One of the other things that we've been working on is border town violence. There's a lot of violence against Navajos and Natives in these small towns that border the Navajo Nation. I just got a report. Well, first there was a Navajo woman who was shot 5 times by a police officer in Winslow for allegedly shoplifting cheap booze and a pack of cigarettes. She loses her life. And then I just got yesterday another woman, she was probably a transgender woman, I'm not sure yet, who died in Gallup. And Navajo people routinely die murdered, missing in Gallup. It's just routine and nobody ever says anything. It's undocumented, it's unacknowledged. So those are some of the spaces where there's a sense of belonging that gets created.
So maybe I'll just ask one more follow-up if I can. And so that also suggests there's a really important methodological strategy at work in what you're doing, which is, if you like, writing against the genealogical method and honing in on the biographical as one element. Would that be part of it, that the telling of women's and other gendered people's stories?
I think one of the things that I think is important about the work that we do and the scholarship that we do as Indigenous scholars and means and Diné scholars, that for me it's always about justice for my people. And wherever you want to start, I tell my students, just jump in anywhere, because the task is monumental. It's incredible what we're up against. And so just on a daily basis, I practice it myself, and then a lot of my students take the message to heart and they do the same kinds of work, I'm not particularly interested in work that is about making us citizens who, when we get through with college, will be very good debt-ridden consumers. That's not what it's about for me. And then some of my early work has really interrogated the male dominance in tribal leadership, and women's leadership, which is in the public space, is still some people really discourage and are against it, our own people. So opening up those spaces, being on the Human Rights Commission and bringing the question of women's leadership, violence against women, LGBTQ. It's wonderful in those spaces. So I'm sitting there, and there's 2 women and 3 men, and our executive director is a man as well. And our chair of the Human Rights Commission is a medicine man. So I'm sitting there, and the men are talking about gender. And they're in their late 50s and early 60s, and they're talking about what it means to be a Navajo man in a matrilineal system. And who else would foster those conversations if I hadn't brought it to the table and said, we need to talk about this. So I sit there and listen to them, and it's just wonderful. One of them, they're talking about when you're in a matrilineal system and you're married into a Navajo family, you do not bother with their issues and what they have. You sit there quietly and you mind your own business. When your wife's family comes, which is an extended family, when they come, you sit quietly or you leave the room because it's none of your business. And then they start talking about we recognize and understand that our property goes to our women, to our daughters and our granddaughters. We understand that. That's how it works. So what will I leave my sons? So it's nice to in those spaces to hear that kind of reflection and talk. So.
Hi, thank you for that really wonderful paper. I guess my question is kind of about the role of data or proof in knowledge making or seeking justice. So I was really struck by both the kind of iconicity of Diné having multiple spirits, particularly within like larger LGBTQ narratives, right? It's like, oh, well, the Diné, they like had it right. So it's in some ways you're kind of held up as, as doing something very different compared to the like settler sexualities. But then I think what your work is doing like so beautifully is pointing out, that kind of infernal paradox and contradiction through which contemporary queer Diné people are suffering immense amounts of violence that are both coming internally and externally. So I guess the question is, because I feel like part of it is, being able to go back to the historical record and saying like, okay, well, we do have records of there being multiple genders in the Diné Nation, but then there's something about like there being no statistics yet on violence towards Diné LGBTQ natives. So I was just wondering if you could talk both about that crazy like hypervisibility and invisibility, which coheres like across kind of like space and time. If that makes sense.
It's something that's really hard to get at because we have the personal testimony, we have the narratives, we have the police logs that we have that, and yet somehow we don't respond to it, or it's not like an immediacy for our leaders, for example. And I'm still trying to think through that about just this. I don't know what it is about. We can't seem to do that. Get that so that we can begin to work on the larger structures of how this violence sustains and perpetuates itself. The dialogue or the discourse is always, and it just like drives me nuts, is that any kind of problem, any kind of issue, well, if you just go back to your tradition, if you just go back to the culture, everything will be okay. And so I was talking to one of a grad student, Navajo guy, and I said, and I just got through reading the Navajo Brain Drain report, which says that Navajo leaders should be alarmed because our young people are migrating to urban spaces at an alarming rate. and we're really losing the best of our children to these urban spaces, you know. And the solution is just go back to your culture and tradition, you know. And I'm just like, why do we even bother studying, writing, researching? We already know what the answer is. The answer to every single thing is if we go back to our culture and tradition, everything will be okay, you know. And I just trying to get people to think critically, which I think is what the work of my colleagues here have done just beautifully, I think. To interrogate it, I think, is a really important project, and it's something that I'm working on to bring to raise awareness in my own community.
Thanks so much for your presentation. I was really struck, my question is about intersectionality. I was really struck by your language when you were talking about border towns. I've lived in Gallup briefly and was really struck by it being sort of a garrison town, really. It has the shades of that military occupation feeling it. I'm a historian of immigration, so I think further south in the Navajo Nation to that border. And it, you know, your language about undocumented violence, about laws, about militarized borders is so redolent of the U.S.-Mexico border, of course. So I wonder how you think about borders in an intersectional way.
Well, there's going to be a collection on. Well, it's actually that. Never mind. That's still in the works. But Melanie Yasi and Nick Estes are working on a collection on what borders mean from an indigenous perspective, and one of them being how cities like Albuquerque and Gallup are border towns. You know, what does that mean, and how does that add to how borders are usually talked about in the scholarship? Okay, so that's kind of developing as well. The work that me and my grad students have done on border town violence has really reframed the way in which people understand this violence as systemic, rather than a health model, you know, and a counseling model, which still is the prevalent way to understand this unsustained violence against Native and Navajo people in places like Gallup.
I've got a question about the problems with the English word and concept of family.
Mm-hmm.
I've always thought that sort of the more politically efficacious move was to expand our notion of family and to think of it in larger and more capacious ways. But your work points, I think, more toward a historical event in which what's the word?
Okay.
Is both through law and through sort of the snow imagery is privatized and taken out of the social world and put into the family, which makes me think of the family as a model of depoliticizing relationships and moving them away from a larger community. So I'm wondering if you find the idea of that idea of the family as being a one that causes more problems than it gives us.
That's a really good question. I'll have to think about that, because when you look at the scholarship on nation and nation building, the language of family is used to describe nation. It becomes a metaphor and naturalize it. And when we talk about family, we're imagining, because that's what we've been taught, a nuclear family unit. You know? And in Navajo, extended family, clan relationships is something that I still have to work through, because it's not recognizable within tribal formations. It's very recognizable and practiced in communities and community organizing, you know, for example. So that's a good question. I'll have to think about some more about what that is.
Anyone else?
Thank you.
Thank you.